All right, we are back, and today, once again, for those of you not watching but listening, I am joined by the defending 64 kilo Australian Olympic weightlifting champion, the MTMM head nutritionist, and master's student, and someone who feels like she doesn't get enough of the credit of what she does around here. My beautiful, lovely wife, Katrina, as I mentioned, also our MTMM lead nutritionist. So thank you once again for making time in your crazy schedule to fit in me and my podcasting. And I've really been enjoying these conversations. I've had a lot of really good feedback that it's nice that someone else is doing a lot of the talking as well, which
I
is
think
good.
people just like that I rein you into 20 minutes.
Yeah, maybe since you started, we've definitely halved the amount of time that we're recording. So thank you. It is becoming a habit, and it's becoming a habit I'm really enjoying, hashing some of these issues that we see a lot and that keep coming up. And today, speaking of issues that often come up, we're going to talk a little bit about those unspoken fundamentals of setting yourself up for specifically fat loss phases, weight loss diets. But we want to go a little bit more than your standard or typical calories in, calories out, ensuring calorie deficit, eating more vegetables, eating more protein, drinking more water. We're going to start this conversation with an assumption of knowledge that if you're listening to this podcast, you're someone that has probably developed that level of awareness of the practical things to do. So we want today's conversation to focus a little bit more around the peripheral, or those kind of like attitudes, perspective, mindset shifts that really need to occur if we're going to have a successful fat loss phase. And I say fat loss because I'm deliberately talking about the reduction of adipose tissue, and recomposition, and I guess so far as that assumed knowledge goes, I'm assuming that, that is what people are after. They want to lose body fat. I still have yet to work with a client who has just said, hey, I just want to lose indiscriminate weight.
I want to lose all my lean mass.
Yeah, and maybe that's a really good one to sort of start off on, is if this is something you're setting out and embarking to do, the first thing that we need to do is be very deliberate in what it is specifically that we are looking to achieve, very determined in terms of numbers and amounts and timeframes, but very much as well, why? Why are we embarking on something deliberately like this? What's the rationale? What's the purpose? Because as we're going to get into, it's hard. The fat loss phase is hard. It's, an amount of change that is uncomfortable. You're going to be doing things very, most likely more structured, more regimented, more disciplined than you may have otherwise. If nothing changes, right? And in that moment, when you do want to fall back into some of those old habits or some of those prevailing behaviors, if your why is, I don't really know, I've just picked an arbitrary number that I would like to lose 5 kilos, it's not enough in that moment to often continue past that first week or that second week.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
100%. I think that if you're doing something to do it, or because you've been told to do it, or because everybody around you is doing something, that's not going to be enough to pull you through the hard times, like you said, right? You need a clear understanding of how it's going to benefit you, as a little bit of motivation, because as we're building those habits, and this is something we talked about on a recent podcast, the habits are what's actually going to get you to your goal. But as you're laying the groundwork for them and building them, you do need that little bit of motivation, right? So I think understanding something beyond a number on a scale. Now, a number on a scale might be exactly the motivation you need if you're competing out of a weight class-based sport.
Yeah.
But for the general population, I want to be 60 kilos, I want to be 65, I want to be 87, whatever it is, like, why is that number important to you? And something we often talk about our clients with when we're getting started is, if they come to us with a goal, okay, so, but let's say you're starting at 70 kilos and your goal is to get to 65. let's say in 6 months' time, we actually finish you off at 70 kilos and you're exactly the same weight, but you're down 2 dress sizes and, you're starting to see an outline of abs and you're feeling strong in the gym and you've got energy and you've got all of these other things, and especially if fat loss was your goal and physically you're looking so much leaner and better than you were to start with, does it matter that you were 65? Some people will say yes. Yeah. It does matter. They have a connection to that. It is important to them, and that's kind of a different thing altogether. But if that number doesn't matter, if you're improving on yourself, then we need to find a better metric or a better reason.
I think the goal weight, what would you call it, hysteria is something that's, and I think scale weight in general as a metric is something that's blown considerably out of proportion in terms of its importance. And, further to what you've just said, my argument would be that if you don't actively compete in a weight class based sport, then your weight really doesn't matter, right? For the most part. Now, for our CrossFitters, a kilo or two can make a lot of difference when you're inverted. And if you're working on your gymnastics and that's something that you want to improve, that small amount of change in weight can make a pretty fundamental difference.
Yes and no. I've yet to come across an athlete who at a heavier but leaner body fat percentage performs poorer. Mm-hmm. So it makes a difference if you're carrying around extra adipose tissue for sure. Yeah. But again, that scale weight is not the be all end all.
Yeah. The funny thing, I'm not sure about you, but I definitely see a lot that people that tend to come in with specific goals surrounding specific weight numbers, the number they tend to pick often isn't reflective of a relative or a comparative time in their life, right? And what I mean by that is we might sit down with someone who says, why that number? Oh, I want to weigh that number because that was when I last felt really comfortable in my body and really like the way that my clothes fit and everything else. And that's okay, that was a decade ago, before 10 years of, progressively overloaded strength and resistance training, before 2 or 3 kids, before a mortgage, before a full-time career. So if the weight that you were the last time you were 17 or 18 and super athletic, because that's the only obligation you had at the time, it's probably not a fair goal to assume that you're going to be able to get back necessarily to that same place. And potentially what you're after there is not that 60 kilo scale weight, but that feeling of really being able to be quite self-focused on things that specifically you want to do. Make sense?
And so that's where those kind of the 5 stages of whys come in, right? So digging a little bit deeper. Okay, well, why do you want to be 60 kilos then? Why is that going to make you happy? Oh, it's because when I felt most vital and alive and energetic, and I could go do my training session and I could go swim and play with my kids or whatever after. It's okay, see, it's not actually the scale weight, it's how you felt at that weight, right? And now we can keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper and find maybe a more appropriate goal and something that actually is going to have you stoked to work towards it, other than just staring at the number on a digital machine every day.
It's definitely more confronting when you dig a little under the surface there, but like we said before, in that moment where the opportunity to make a decision that gives you that instant gratification now or progresses you towards that kind of longer term goal, if you're just wanting to lose 20 kilos is very different to being, I want to be around as a father for more than the next 10 years and I can see if I don't change what I'm doing, then that is at risk. Right? It's a much great motivator really to get going. So I think being very clear and really digging deep into why you want to undertake a weight loss or a fat loss phase, and 2, determining whether specific weight class or weight goals are appropriate for you are probably the 2 biggest factors there.
And then finding a metric that is appropriate for you if it turns out that isn't.
Correct.
Right.
Pictures, measurements, weight on the barbell,
energy
consistency in getting into classes or into the gym, all great metrics to show that you are actually progressing towards that intended goal, which is ultimately going to be performance or health based.
And it's very subjective, but feeling comfortable in your skin or in your clothes, it's there or it's not. right? And so that is like, if that's something that you're measuring and you're kind of checking in with yourself and reflecting every day, that's something that can be a measurement of progress too. It doesn't have to be those, kind of conventional measures that we always see.
The confidence one is another good one, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but I think so often what we see is people assume that once I get to that weight, I'm going to be just super happy. And I think that the unfortunate thing is, and as someone, who's been through that, it's like, if you don't have confidence in who you are as a person, you're just going to be a lighter, miserable, or still as miserable. You're going to be a sad Hulk, right? So I think that if you're thinking that losing the weight will make you this completely different person or this more confident person, losing weight isn't going to solve all those peripheral issues that you have with why you feel like you need to do a weight loss or a fat loss diet. So, we almost preface before you decide doing it is really understanding if it's for you. And we almost do with our clients as well before entering this phase, what we would call like a mental flag check, right? Or a pre-fat loss assessment, which we go through and understand, if you're someone who has a history of becoming overly obsessive or heavily restricting or a yo-yo dieter, all in, all out kind of mentality, heavily restrict, heavily binge, then the answer is like a fat loss approach, particularly for where you might be at right now, is probably not appropriate before you get into anything else.
Or even if you don't necessarily identify with having any of those things, but you have just an anxiety or a fear of food, we probably need to address those factors before we start, cutting things out and bringing things down. Because it's important to have a really good base and a really good plan going into it. How long are you going into a fat loss phase for? What are the goals? What are our metrics? What are we going to do when we hit the end of that designated period of time or weight loss? How are we going to build out of that? Because I think...
Don't skip too far ahead.
I think that, when we plan out, the very, very beginning of the fat loss phase is difficult. Once you get into it and get some momentum, it's actually pretty easy. What I see being a huge problem for a lot of people is once we get to kind of that end segment of the fat loss phase and we turn to maintenance, that can be a huge issue for a lot of people and it causes a lot of anxiety. So I like to evaluate what we're going to do when we get there before we even start. Because the goal is not to get you into a deficit and then you stay there forever.
Yeah, I think that's a point that cannot be overstated. Is that we don't have, as a community, we have no trouble losing weight. We're really, actually pretty good at losing weight, but we are terrible at maintaining new weight.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is a lot of the approaches that get taken are unsustainable long term, right? Which is how we get into those yo-yo dieting effects where people crash and burn and end up in a worse position when they start. And now hormonally, we can go into that maybe another episode of what actually occurs there. But if your fat loss phase is exceptionally miserable, how much fun do you think the maintenance of that new weight is going to be? Right? And I think that that's probably another thing that gets missed in the world of social media and Instagram influencers is like abdominals as a sign of like health and performance are not correlative to either of those things. And it can be that when you're at your leanest, you're actually at your most miserable because of the behavioral implications or the restrictions that have to go into achieving that certain physique. Yeah. And I guess the other part that's not mentioned often is that, especially with things like physique competitors, is you're achieving an aesthetic for a few hours, right? It's a dehydration as much as it is a fat loss. You get up, you have your wings on, you have your bikini on, you have your posing trunks on, you get your photos taken, you flex, you get your trophy. But then by the time all that's finished, your physique has already changed because you're starting to rehydrate, you're starting to eat again, and then what normally happens is they bring out the donuts and off it goes, right?
I mean, arguably it's the same in the weightlifting world, maybe not to the same extreme, right? But it's like you're achieving a scale weight for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? We just want you at weight for 2 minutes, enough time to get on that scale, and then we're going to rehydrate, we're going to eat, we're going to, look, feel completely different after that. Yeah, you're not going into the same kind of levels, But that's not, the goal is not to be walking around like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess like determining an appropriate weight class, I've got so many episodes coming up that we can do. So yeah, I think a little bit of a screening and making sure first that, you know, you're in a mental or a mind space that's going to be okay and cope well with what's to come.
And then developing a really solid plan, right? What does this look like? How long do we go? How do we know when we've kind of reached our goal for now? Because a lot of fat loss is going to need to occur in stages. You're going to need to do a little bit of a deficit. You're going to need to go to maintenance for a bit. You're going to need to go back into a deficit, and that could take a year or years. It's very rare that for most of my clients, we would achieve all of their fat loss goals and dreams in just one cut. And that's because you're not going to leave someone in a massive deficit for 20 weeks at a time, right? That's just not good for your health. That's not good hormonally. So we need to have a little bit of a plan. We need to be very clear between coach and client what that plan is, what it looks like, and yeah, a realistic time frame. Once we have that plan, there has to be an understanding that, yeah, we've decided this is appropriate for you. Now it's going to be hard. We're going to have to put in some work. And I think we're very afraid of that in today's society, that working hard or, removing some of the pleasures from your everyday life is this negative thing and we should never do that. And that's very triggering. And no, like you got to do hard things to get results in life. But we don't want to bring you into this hard, exceptionally miserable place and hold you there. That's not the goal. If that's what your plan entails, we might need to reevaluate the map.
Well, you don't get extra points for unnecessary suffering, right? And I think that a lot of what we stand for is education about nutrition. And so, yes, we are talking about macro manipulation and like a caloric deficit, but you still have freedoms within both of those in which you can make it more bearable, arguably.
I know personally for me, my approach whenever I'm in a cut is I like to have one meal a day that I really look forward to.
Breakfast.
Often, yeah, it's generally breakfast. And I will go all out. I'll have my pancakes with like my real peanut butter on top, like whatever it is. And I will make the sacrifices later in the day. I'll have the kind of pared down veggies and lean chicken and things like that, and clean carbs for the rest of the day to afford me that little bit of luxury in the morning. And that keeps me happy enough to keep going. For someone else, it might be they want a couple squares of dark chocolate after dinner, whatever it is. Yeah. They want to be able to have one meal off program a week, that they're just not thinking about tracking, whatever. You need to set up something where you have joy within that, because there is a lot of emotional and social ties to food. But likewise, it's probably not realistic to embark on a fat loss plan and say, oh, but I've got an event or two every week that I want to drink at and I want to fully engage and I don't want to have to worry about and expect to lose X number of weight over a period of weeks.
Again, if you're making the decision that this is something that you want to do, it needs to be something that you want to do.
It's your choice.
Yeah, no one's making you undertake a fat loss phase or a weight loss phase or a bulk or anything else. Like, this needs to be your goal that you're going out to do. And so part of setting a goal of that nature is understanding that there's going to be social events or occasions or whatever it is for this particular period of time where, no, it's not okay to drink. Right? Or no, it's not okay to just go off and have a couple of days untracked, because you've come and said, this is something I specifically want to do. We've set up a timeline to do that. And so there's going to be a specific period where we have to tighten the reins a little bit in order to achieve the goal that you've told us is important that you want to achieve.
Yeah.
Right? I cannot stress enough when talking of dates, the end date. Right? There needs to be an end date in your fat loss diet, or at least a planned refeed period. Yeah. Because if there's not, you're now not doing a fat loss diet, you're just restricting your intake. Yeah. And if you're just restricting your intake for extended periods of time, you're probably the kind of individual that has a history of restricting binging, which is just undoing the restricting work if your goal is to create a caloric deficit anyway.
You're now creating a lifestyle and a habit that is not conducive to health and wellness mentally and physically.
Correct. And being in that restrictive mindset and always focusing on what you can't have, and I'm not allowed to eat this and I can't do that for extended periods of time, that is what leads to disordered eating habits. That is what leads to binge eating. That is what leads to, you know, those kind of like yo-yo dieters where it's, oh, I've tried everything and nothing's worked, right? And it's a little bit of that, you've tried everything for an unassumable amount of time because we don't know, because you haven't tried anything for A, long enough, or B, properly for an extended period to actually see the impact and effect that it has.
And I think that's what we see a lot of is people who have been in restriction for years and years and years, but they're so restricted that they're only half in restriction, if that makes sense, right? Like they're so restricted that they're bouncing out, and that's why they're not seeing results. And it's really setting up that binge restrict, binge restrict, binge restrict. So kind of like giving yourself the, you know, the breakfast that you look forward to, you've got to have a plan that encompasses and allows for pleasure within that so that you don't feel overly restricted. No, you're not able to have everything you want all the time at every single meal, but you're still able to enjoy yourself and progress forward.
Yeah. Having that sense of control too, again, when you understand that this is something that you want to do for this particular amount of time to achieve this specific goal for this reason, it does make it easier to say, I'm actually going to measure out a serving of ice cream rather than just like guess, right? Or I'm actually going to measure my peanut butter rather than just see how much I can fit on the spoon and call it a teaspoon. And I think, and again, given the compliance challenge that we've just come off, I think most people would actually be quite surprised with just how much of a difference the mindless act or the, you know, accidental overshooting can actually impact over the course of a day. How much that actually can eradicate a deficit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reading an article the other day and it was talking about, you know, people who are tracking but doing that insensible cal intake and how the underestimation of calories is on average about 1,000 a day.
Yeah, 1,000 calories
It's
a
half
day.
your intake for a lot of people, right?
Yeah, so if you're on 2,000 calories a day and trying to deficit, like or trying to create a caloric deficit, and then
you're eating 3,000.
Yeah, that's a lot, right? And it's depending on what you're happening to go to when you do snack. It's actually quite easy. Like, and we always talk about especially working from home, if you're just grabbing a small handful of almonds or cashews each time you walk through the kitchen, like that's not so bad until you realize you've walked through the kitchen 10 or 12 times over the course of the day and you've put away a couple of 100 grams, you know, of almonds, which is
calorically dense,
50 or 60 grams of fat, right, at minimum.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think even just taking some time where before you decide I'm going to embark, or when you're setting up an appropriate amount of intake for that deficit, maybe just spending a week or two actually only eating what you're tracking, or actually seeing where your actual intake lies as opposed to your perceived intake lies is probably not a bad idea either.
Definitely gives your coaches a lot more to work with, right? So
we have talked about timeframes a little bit and setting an end date. I think setting an appropriate end date as well, or an appropriate timeline for that first block of fat loss. Obviously, the more weight you feel like you have to lose, the more weight or the more time, you should be giving yourself to achieve that goal. If you've got 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 kilos that you want to lose, you're probably not going to do that in a year. And if you're doing that in a year, I'm going to suggest that you're taking measures that are unsustainable long term, and again, fall back into the play, end up in a worse position than when you started, right? One last point that I want to bring up. We talk a lot about not rewarding ourselves with food, or that we shouldn't see food as something that we need to earn. We're not dogs. It's not a treat for good behavior. But I think that a cut in particular is something that you have to earn. And I think if you're wanting to go out, and again, this is more for those clients that have an extended history of long-term deficit restriction, if you think you're ready to do a fat loss cut, and you're one of my clients, I want to see 4 to 6 to 8 to 12 weeks of you at maintenance beforehand. Show me that you can commit to a profile where the goal isn't restriction or fat loss, so that we can build up some confidence and consistency and some behaviors and some practices that then when we do flick that switch, you know, we've, number one, got a baseline to work off.
Number two, it's actually going to work because you're not so deregulated and, you know,
right. And I guess in many cases too, metabolically, if you can be stable at 2,300 calories, you don't need to be on 1,400 to create a deficit.
If you've been in a deficit for years and years and years, like, your metabolic rate has to come down to match your level of intake. And now you want to go into a cut and you've got a depressed metabolic rate, like, it's not going to work. It's only going to make you sicker, right? Yeah. So depending on what your history is and where you're coming from, it may be that you need maintenance for even longer than that. But that's such an individual question or concern. But yes, I think absolutely starting there.
Yeah. The goal for most should be how much can I eat and be at maintenance,
of good quality food.
Yeah, rather than how little can I get away with eating and just trying to survive my workouts. And when you understand a little bit more about TDE, the more you eat and the more unintentionally active you can be, or incidentally active, and the more you get out of training sessions, the more you're going to be able to burn.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just do a quick recap summary before deciding that fat loss is for you. Mentally, where are you at? Is this something that is going to trigger some overly obsessive, overly compulsive, heavily restricted kind of behaviors? If so, it's probably not the right time for a fat loss phase. Number two, get clear on your goal and your why. What's your motivation? Like, why do you want to lose weight? Why do you want to drop fat? You know, number three, into that, for how long is this phase going to continue? When are you coming back up to maintenance? When are you taking that break? At what date is that goal that you have to be at a specified weight or aesthetic for? When's that over? And what's the rebuild phase on the other side of that for 4, 6, 8 weeks look like, right? What else have I got there? And earning the cut, which we just finished on. Spending some time at maintenance, getting used to those behaviors of consistently applied, you know, mindful practice when it comes to eating, developing a high baseline, and then deciding you're ready to flick the switch and be prepared for some sacrifice and some hard work.
Perfect 60-second wrap up.
Easy. Thank you.